Hey everyone, I see we have people joining. Welcome to the session. I believe we're going to start with a quick video about Catalyst 2030 before we dive in. So I'll wait for that as people join. And as we wait for people to join, if you could go ahead and just throw into the chat what brings you here, who you are and what brings you here, I can model it. It'd be great to get to know others in the room. Welcome. As people filter in, and before we get started, I believe we have a video we're going to queue up. And again, I will post in the chat who I am. And if you all can post who you are, we can get to know each other in the chat before we speak on video here.
Catalyst 2030 started life as a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real transformational change. Launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020, it's grown into a global movement accelerating change to ensure the SDGs are reached by 2030. Fueled by passion, our 550 members working in 175 countries have collectively put in an amazing 50,000 volunteer hours, touching the lives of 2 billion people. And we're driven by values, to which we hold ourselves accountable. 2020 was a busy year, co-creating 3 reports with partners and producing one of our own. Inviting high-level guests to participate in the Catalyzing Change campaign, hosting fireside chats and expert hours, which will be continuing in 2021. To celebrate our achievements, together we placed our supporters in the limelight with the first Catalyst 2030 Awards for Systemic Change. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, we celebrated finalists and winners in the following categories: special recognition for our early supporters, individual philanthropists, donor organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, corporate organizations, bi- and multilateral organizations, and 4 regional winners in the category of national governments. And now on to Catalyzing Change Week 2021. During this social entrepreneur-led event, we bring together diverse stakeholders in over 100 sessions to showcase their systems change efforts and the best practices that can accelerate our work in pursuit of the SDGs.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. And it's great to see the mix of perspectives we have coming together in the chat. I'm Catherine Cheney, and I work with David Bornstein, who you'll hear from in just a moment at the Solutions Journalism Network. I also work with DevX, a media platform focused on global health and international development. So hopefully what value I can bring to this conversation is how I look at these stories as a journalist. But I think the bigger question we're aiming to address in this session is why solutions journalism, rigorous reporting on responses to problems, matters in achieving the SDGs. And as someone who's covered the Sustainable Development Goals and efforts to achieve those goals over the past 6 years, I think I've heard this come up time and again. The narrative matters, right? We can't just have work happening in all these disparate places without lessons being shared. And in my mind, solutions journalism is the tool to do that. Reporting on how people are working to address problems, what evidence there is that that approach might be working, what the limitations are, what insights might help others respond. And so David can tell you a little bit more about his journey as a social entrepreneur, both covering the world of social entrepreneurship. Many of you may have read his book, How to Change the World, which I know has been highly influential to many social entrepreneurs. He's covered this space, but he's also entered this space as the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network. And in addition to hearing about what we do and why we do it, I think David might kind of lift the curtain a bit on some of our own thoughts about systems change. And maybe we can even work together to figure out how the Solutions Journalism Network takes more of a systems change approach, because we're very much at an inflection point as an organization, and he can speak to that. But essentially what we're trying to focus on today is, because the SDGs can't happen without sharing knowledge about what's effective, the onus is not just on journalists to tell these stories, but it's on you all as change makers to pitch these stories and to understand how to pitch these stories in a way where it's not the person or the organization who's the hero, it's the idea that's the hero. And we'll talk about what that looks like. David will also walk you through our Solution Story Tracker, which is a resource where you can check out thousands of responses all over the world that seem to be working and showing promise in achieving the SDGs. So with that, I want to go ahead and hand it over to David. And I would just encourage those who are joining us live to please post in the chat what brings you here. And then we also have this recorded as a resource for others who can't join us live, but want to tune in and understand why the narrative matters in achieving progress on the SDGs and what they as individual change makers can do to advance that. So David, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Kat. Thanks so much. Nice to see everybody. I thought maybe spend a couple minutes talking a little bit about the history of the Solutions Journalism Network and kind of how it emerged out of it, for me, the coverage of the field of social entrepreneurship, and then just kind of open it up for questions and see how it, because I think that there are implications for everybody's work, as Kat mentioned. So basically, I grew up in Canada. I became a journalist. I moved to New York City. I became a journalist 30 years ago, and was sort of doing normal reporting for New York City newspapers. But then I really got into the field of social change and social innovation by spending 5 years writing a book about microfinance. I spent a year in Bangladesh and focused on the Grameen Bank. And it was really out of that experience that I was able to really see there's a really interesting story about how do you create a new kind of organization, in this case, a bank, that is able to bank effectively with people who have historically been excluded from financial systems. How did you do that? How do you carry the money? How do you calculate interest? How do you make it sustainable? All of those questions were really interesting how-to questions that seemed very important to share. And that's where the idea of, like, for many of you, most of you are not, if you don't know journalism, there's this thing in journalism called the 5 W's, where you're supposed to ask who, what, when, where, and why. But you'll notice there's no H in that list. There's no how. And for people who are really trying to solve social problems, the how question, the how do you do it, is really the essence of the challenge, and sharing that knowledge is so vital. So later on, I sort of carried that with me into a book that I had written about Ashoka Fellows. And that's where I met Drew many years ago in India in 2000 when she was running an organization called Childline. And really looking at 100 social entrepreneurs around the world and how they had or were trying to advance system change ideas in different places. And what really struck me in traveling around as a journalist, I had 5 years and this incredible privilege to look at these stories, was when my mind was filled with all of these stories of extraordinary efforts to solve problems. When I would talk about them with all of my friends back home, nobody had any idea that any of this was going on. It was like nobody was telling the story of what's emerging in the world that's corrective, the destabilizing but positive destabilizing changes, rather than the negative stuff, the stuff that was harmful. So it felt like in the whole way that journalism was constructed, it was like a smoke alarm that never stopped going off, telling you what you should be afraid of, what is urgent, what is a threat. But it was never really telling people what are the emerging possibilities, what are the corrective mechanisms, what are these orchids coming up out of cracks in the pavement around the world that had tremendous potential to teach people new ways that systems could be run, that organizations could be run, new methods, new ideas, in some ways new technology in some cases. So that was really the origin idea for solutions journalism, was to really kind of give journalism a serious transformation, where to move it from a system that basically said what's broken, what's corrupt, what's pathological is what we should focus on every day, to what we should focus on is we need to know our threats, we need to know our challenges, but we need to know every day what our options are. What are the emerging options that can help us understand not just how to critique the past, but how to build a better future? What is the knowledge that every day feeds that, creates the energy, creates the knowledge, creates the hope, and also reduces the fear and the anxiety that will translate into terrible political situations and authoritarian regimes, as we're seeing. Too much fear and anxiety makes people do really bad things. So that's the basic idea. And in essence, what solutions journalism is, if you just boil it down, it's telling stories that look at how people are trying to solve problems and what we can learn from their efforts, whether they succeed or whether they fail, trying to share the insights on a daily basis, and then trying to cross-pollinate that knowledge around the world so that we can learn, we can create a kind of all teach, all learn world where everybody who's working on things has something that they may learn from somebody across the world or across the river. You know, that's the idea, to create a kind of articulated network where that kind of knowledge can flow, like a central nervous system for good effort. So that's the basic idea. Our network, we're a nonprofit organization. We have a staff of 40, and the network currently includes, we've worked with 500 news organizations, mainly in the US, in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, in Africa, Latin America, and in Canada. So that's the reach currently, and about 20,000 journalists. And I'm going to show the resource that Kat mentioned, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just open it up for a conversation. Because one of the things that I hope would be most helpful is, as someone who has written a lot about social entrepreneurs, helping people tell their stories and open up the arteries of journalism so that these stories from social entrepreneurs can flow much more readily and much more effectively than they have in the past, to kind of like unclog the arteries, like a good angiogram for social innovation. Okay, but this is a resource that I want to introduce, and I'm hoping that there's ways also that we can help you use this resource by you telling us what kind of things you might want out of it. So just let me pull this up. Okay, so this is the core search page for the solution story tracker. It's a database that has roughly 12,000 stories in it that look at pretty much, well, today 11,617 stories that are gathered from more than 1,000 news organizations around the world. And all of these stories look at an effort to solve a social problem and what can be learned from it. And one of the ways you can search it is by sustainable development goals. So you can say, I'm interested in zero hunger. And I'll say, I'm interested in, you can narrow it down and say, in zero hunger in, say, Africa. Let's just say that. Okay. So there's 70 stories that come up tagged that way. And what you'll notice is these stories are very different than what you do if you go to Google News and you just type in zero hunger. You'll get mostly problem stories. These will all be solutions-oriented stories. So the Magic Greenhouse from the BBC, how food changed the course of a protest in Nigeria from the Life and Time. And if you click on any of these links, it will take you to an abstract. It'll tell you what that story is about, what the tags are, and a bunch of other related stories. Oh, there's one from me. And from that. And so that's, it's designed to be able to kind of give you X-ray vision into the world of social change in a way that you can find peers, you can find ideas, you can also find journalists who write about solutions as a way to actually pitch your story. So this is, and the publications that carry those. So if you want to get your message out, you'll also be able to find people in this resource who are like-minded in a sense. All right, I'm going to stop there. And maybe I'll just pause there. Is there anything that we should add, Kat, that struck you that
Sure. I think a couple things. So one thing I think would be useful for everyone to understand before we get to essentially how these social entrepreneurs can better pitch their stories in a way that captures the problem they're trying to solve and how they're working to solve it. But when it comes to the Solutions Journalism Network, and your work as a social entrepreneur, I'd love for you to expand on how our own definition of what solutions journalism is has become more nuanced or perhaps expanded over time. For example, with some of our work on complicating the narratives and asset framing, I think that would be a good thing to get to. And then maybe we can talk about the inflection point I kind of previewed earlier, like where we are as an organization. I think that would just be useful context for everyone.
Okay, sure. And then, so our original definition for solutions journalism was what I said before: stories that really look at rigorous reporting that looks at how people are trying to solve problems. Most of our staff are US based, and we, like many other countries, have an extraordinary problem with polarization today, where people are sort of constitutionally incapable of listening to people who are on other sides of the political divide. And so one of the things that we've integrated in our work are trainings for journalists in how to listen deeply to people across a fault line. And this is actually a knowledge that we've borrowed from the field of conflict mediation. And so in the solutions journalism work, we actually are looking at deep listening techniques as well. It turns out that's also really helpful for another thing we're doing. One of the biggest problems we see with solutions journalism, which in itself helps journalism, but has its own problems, and it suffers from the savior syndrome, which is the notion that the social, the story will focus on the program as the hero, or the organization, or this social entrepreneur coming from outside a community to go fix this broken community. And it ends up painting communities as sort of passive or helpless beneficiaries of this really good policy or this really good program. And you can see how that reinforces narratives that are stigmatizing, that are narratives of incapacity or lack of agency for people experiencing poverty, or people of different demographic groups. In the United States, it's very racialized. It's very racialized around the world, actually. So we have also integrated a framework we call asset framing, which is basically when you introduce people, it's very important to understand what their aspirations and strengths are before you start talking about all their challenges that they're facing, whether it's poverty or injustice or violence or what have you. It turns out that the brain will, when we hear people through a lens of their agency and their aspirations, we actually mobilize against the system that's thwarting those aspirations, rather than considering that person or that group to be a threat. It's a really interesting, it comes from cognitive science. It's been demonstrated many times. And so in solutions journalism, we're very committed to framing communities through their aspirations and their agency before, and not just getting into like what's wrong, which is the normal instinct for journalists, is just to go right for the problem and leave out everything else. So this is really contributes to a lot of denigration, a lot of racism. So we build that in, and it's something that is a really helpful thing when talking about how you pitch stories, how you frame stories, who has the agency in the story. Is it your organization, or is it the community that the organization perhaps is working with? So we could get into talking about that as well. But these are the nuances that have been added to the work in the last couple of years to address a good idea that itself produces inequities when it's not done well. That was the realization we had.
Thanks for that. And in terms of where we are as an organization and this point on systems change that came up in the introduction video, and I know is also just a huge focus of Catalyst 2030, I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit. I mean, typically, the way the Solutions Journalism Network has worked in the past is a lot of trainings with journalists, with newsrooms, training, connecting, and supporting journalists. But David mentioned earlier, all teach, all learn. We are moving in that direction. And in fact, this session is kind of in that spirit. So David, can you just speak to that a little bit in terms of systems change for the Solutions Journalism Network, what that looks like?
Yeah. So basically, I mentioned we have a network of 500 news organizations and 20,000 journalists. We've also worked with 100 journalism schools. And then we have allies in other fields as well. And our goal right now is to really give away the IP. We want any news organization, any university, really any organization in the world that wants to become an expert in solutions journalism and wants to train it or wants to be able to share that. We want to create many-to-many learning opportunities, so that because solutions journalism looks very different in Africa than it does in the UK, for example. Journalists have different goals. They approach their work differently. They have different relationships to their communities. So this is an idea that needs to be kind of relocalized wherever it goes, because of the cultural context, because of the history, because of the trust levels in journalism. All of those things are different. And so we're very much looking for people who would just want to say, we'd love to become a reservoir of this. We'd love to be able to find ways to share the knowledge of how to do this storytelling, or alternatively, we'd love to partner and be able to use the solution story tracker in a way to share knowledge with different constituencies. This is a database that is freely available, and we're happy to create and work with people to create ways of looking at or ways of using it that are specific to different organizational goals. So the idea is we don't want to hold on to this. We'd love to be able to sort of, give it away, and we're all writers, and I'm an author. I mean, we'll all go back to writing our books. The idea is to really give this away. This is not an idea we want to take ownership of in any way. It's really being birthed. And we have resources in 18 languages on our website, how to do solutions journalism. So it's very much a global focus, and all but I think 2 of those toolkits have been translated without us paying any money for that. It's been locally translated by people who wanted to take the idea and import it into their news organization or their news networks. So that's kind of the ethos we're looking for, is really a kind of open sourcing of this. It really is a frame change. I mean, the idea is to move more people in the direction of credible hope and away from reflexive fear, because we see all around the world the impact of building up too much fear through journalism. It produces these extraordinarily dangerous, polarized, and reactive regimes that we're seeing in Brazil. We see it in India. We see it in the United States. We've seen it in the UK, and in Europe in the response to Brexit and all that. So that's very much a cautionary note about what happens when you get too much journalism freaking people out all the time. So we're working very much against that. So I guess that's the ethos, and the invitation is, that's our offer, and our request is, to look at it, to get to know it a little bit, and see, we might be able to do something together, or we know an organization, or we work with news organizations that actually might be interested in connecting, and so we could be a matchmaker of some sort. Those are the kinds of things we could imagine. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, David. I see a lot of questions starting to circulate in the chat around, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, how social entrepreneurs can frame their story in a way that it helps support this narrative shift you mentioned from reflexive fear to credible hope. How do the social entrepreneurs joining us now frame their story in that way? And so I want to open the space up for anyone who would like to unmute and go ahead and ask a question on that, to go ahead and do so. Maybe just tell us a little bit about your organization, how you've pitched your story in the past, and any question you have in terms of how you can perhaps better align the framing of your work with what we're doing at the Solutions Journalism Network. Does anyone want to jump in? I'm just trying to look here if we have any takers, and if not, you can feel free to send.
It could be as simple as, like, how do you pitch effectively to a journalist? I mean, I've been a journalist. I've written columns for newspapers and stuff like that. And people are often, social entrepreneurs are often wondering, like, how do you do that? How do you get your stories out there into the world? Those are, if you have questions about that, we can get into it at any level.
Yeah, go ahead.
Normally, I've worked as a journalist for many years, and now kind of on the dark side of communications and trying to pitch to journalism. To journalists.
Can you say a little bit about yourself? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm basically a science journalist previously based in South Africa, now in the UK, but working with Catalyst to tell their stories, to get the stories out. And the problem that I'm finding is that within South Africa and within Africa, I have great relationships, and it's easy to get a story told because of the relationships that I have with the journalists. But when you're moving out of that space and then trying to pitch something to to a journalist in another country, it's very hard to get that initial contact going when they're probably getting hundreds of emails a day. So that for me is the biggest problem that we're having as Catalyst, to get the stories told.
Yeah, so just getting to know who are the people that you could reach out to, developing those relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, and getting noticed. So even if I identify somebody who is writing about the sector, it's still very difficult to be noticed beyond that. So that was when I looked at the Solutions Journalism Hub, I was thinking maybe there's a way within there that I haven't seen yet, that's you can kind of wave a flag and say, here are some great stories, and see whether anybody wants to pick them up.
Yeah, well, as I said, in the story tracker, and Kat, jump in if you have thoughts about this too, you can restrict it by, a locality or a country or an issue area to see, and then you could get ideas of like, oh, here's 12 journalists that are in this country who have covered these issues from this angle. That's an invitation to reach out to people, say, I see that you're interested in this approach to journalism. We're excited by it. We've connected with SJN, and would you have a conversation with me about pitching, and sort of, I'm trying to get to know the scene kind of thing. I think just that is sort of step one. I mean, there's really no fast way to develop relationships, as you know. You just have to develop them. That's kind of life, But the relationship about what becomes, I want to pitch to you. And that's where it really gets into a very different thing, because most organizations, most journalists are so used to people pitching to them, this is the story about my great idea, my organization, we'd love you to write about us. And there's always this immediate tension, and the journalist immediately contracts and feels like, I'm now being asked to do this person a favor, which is what journalists feel absolutely allergic to. And that's where the tension immediately comes into the relationship, which is what inhibits. But in this mode, in the solution journalism mode, you actually can dissipate that tension, because what you're saying is, there's some real great approaches we're seeing in our network that are emerging. We don't care if you mention Catalyst 2030, it would be great if you did, but here are some ideas that are emerging, and they haven't gotten enough attention. Nobody's written about these ideas. So what you're basically doing is, instead of saying, write about me, you're basically saying, here's a scoop. Here's a lead to something, a tip off to something that you can be ahead of your peers in identifying and recognizing the value of. And if these are truly good ideas that make sense and they haven't gotten much attention, you're doing a huge favor for this person by bringing it to their attention. It's a very profound shift for a journalist. Instead of asking them to, in some ways, what a journalist will hear is like, you want PR. And instead of doing that, you're saying, I actually want to make you smarter. I'm going to try to make you smarter here about poverty, or about hunger, or about gender, or what have you. That you're then an expert person that they will call back and say, hey, that was interesting. What else are you seeing? What other, because you're at this spider at the center of the web position where you're going to be seeing a lot more things than they will about innovation on a regular basis. So think about how valuable that is in their perspective, right? That's the frame shift that makes the relationship sticky, and it becomes more than one story. You become someone that becomes a confidant, someone that is a helper to them on a regular basis. And then you can be, here's 3 more that, you might be interested in, kind of thing, So that's where we see the relationship can really shift and become much more sort of working in partnership in a truer way than normally happens.
I totally agree with David, and I'll just build on that a little bit. Yeah, journalists, myself included, are just inundated with pitches that essentially say, write about me or write about my organization. And I would suggest putting yourself in the shoes of journalists who are inundated by those pitches. And I think one of the best ways to differentiate yourself is to basically understand that journalists are going to be asking, or at least I think journalists should be asking, what value does this add for my audience? And that's part of where solutions journalism comes in. In fact, one resource I might post in the chat, it's a Neiman Lab article that I think summarizes in a very powerful way why solutions journalism matters. And the headline, if I remember it correctly, is, why don't people read the news? Is it because they don't trust us or because we don't add value to their lives? And I think solutions journalism adds value to people's lives. So at DevX, you know, as I try to prioritize how do I spend my time in a given day, I want to add value for my readers. And I think the best way that I can add value is to narrow in on seemingly effective approaches to addressing really complicated problems. So the way I do that is through solutions journalism. That means if someone pitches me and it's write about me or write about my organization, that's not really going to stand out. But if it's, you know, that X issue is a really tricky problem to solve, you know, here are some examples of groups gaining traction, or we are gaining traction in this way. You know, here's some evidence that it works. There are some limitations. It's not a perfect model, right? And I think that's something I'd really reiterate. If you kind of reverse engineer our solutions journalism guidelines and pillars, and then figure out how you pitch journalists looking for those stories, we want to see a response to a problem. We want to see evidence that it's working, but we also want to talk about limitations. No solution's perfect. And if you aren't willing to discuss those limitations, which sometimes, especially people who are in a PR comms position, aren't always free to do, you know, that creates a tension in the reporting process. But most critically, I think insights that can help others respond. So if in that pitch, it's clear to me that this isn't just about an individual or an organization, it's about an approach that can really help others respond, I think that makes a pitch stand out. That's what leads me to choose it, because I'm looking for value for the audience. And I'll post that link in the chat too, just as a resource, but great question. Who else wants to jump in? Is there anyone who, it was interesting to hear, you know, pitching about the Catalyst 2030 effort broadly. Any of you working in the field of social change you want to share a challenge you've had in trying to get your story out there, and maybe we can kind of work through that a bit and it could yield insights that can help others as well? I'm just going through to see if anyone's flagging that they want to speak, or feel free to just unmute and jump in.
I will ask a question if no one else is. And my question is related to the barriers you see amongst social entrepreneurs from telling their stories and how you overcome them. And the reason I ask is so we started a platform to help people set up purpose-driven businesses, businesses together. And one of the key things we want to do is get these people to tell their story moving forward to help inspire other people as well, because it's only through storytelling will it inspire other people. So it is sort of practical tips, I guess.
Can you say more about what your question is more specifically to?
Yeah, so what barriers do you see that prevent social entrepreneurs telling their stories, and then how to overcome them?
Yeah. Well, obviously the main barrier is the gatekeeper, right? If you want your story to appear in someone else's publication, then you have to work through them. There's really no barrier in telling your own story. Or you can create your own publication and just put it up and then use social media to get it out there. So sometimes the barrier is people just don't have enough time to do it well. I mean, there's a cost barrier and a resource barrier. So that would be one thing. I think one of the big barriers beyond the gatekeeper stuff, which we talked about in Lynn's question, is most people don't really know what a story is, frankly. I mean, we all talk about it, but what really makes a good story? We know what a good movie looks like, or what a good story when we read it is, how satisfying it can be. But how do we actually tell stories that engage people? And so one of the frames we use at the Solutions Journalism Network is this really simple, we call it a how done it. for those of you who have read mystery novels like Agatha Christie or Sherlock Holmes, those, you know, those stories that are called whodunits. Does anybody here not know what a whodunit is? Put up your hand if you, put up your hand if you don't know. Okay, so a whodunit is like this, it's this genre of mystery stories that have been around. They're very popular globally. And there's usually a detective or a sleuth who figures out how to solve a problem, how to crack a case. Many TV shows, if you're familiar with the American shows, Law and Order, you know, CSI, Special Victims Unit, House, Sherlock, those are whodunits. It's like, you know, the character's trying to figure out, like, how do I solve the case? How do I catch the bad guy? Whatever. Basically, that's a great story for social entrepreneurs, but switch it from who to how. So the question is, you know, someone wants to do something hard, right? This person wants to improve college graduation rates in a high school where that's an under-resourced high school. This person is trying to run a business to do something that's you know, to sell food at a lower price to a community that doesn't have access to good vegetables or something. So they're facing all these barriers. They're trying to do something difficult, more difficult than the normal business. So now immediately the question is, how are they going to do it? And suddenly you become really curious, like, how did they get the money and how did they find the networks to get the food, and how are they actually going to bring in people to pay them, and will this work? And oh my God, the first shipment didn't even arrive and they had all these problems. How did they deal with it? And you start getting into this how-to set of things that make you actually wonder, like, and then what happened next? And how did they deal with that problem? And you realize you're building a story that's driven by curiosity, which is what a whodunit is, basically. But in this case, and that's really the main barrier in telling stories, is that too many social entrepreneurs, and I know this because I covered them for so many years, too many social entrepreneurs think their story is interesting just because it's important. They're like, you should just pay attention. We're doing God's work, right? So listen, you foolish person. And that's just not how it works. People actually engage with stories because they want to try to figure out what's going to happen next. That's why you stay with most books. What's going to happen next? So I would just say, if you could remember one thing, is like, how do you build curiosity into your stories so that the readers, or if it's video or whatever, are wondering, like, they start like rooting for you, like, how, oh my goodness, this is getting even harder. All their funding was cut, or the grant didn't come in that they were expecting, or, you know, the government started making something more difficult than they expected. And that's exactly when the person is like, okay, how are they going to handle this problem? That's where you lean in. When, you know, when Harry Potter is in the most dangerous situation, you're like, how is he going to get out of this mess this time? And that's when you start caring. So this is a narrative form that works so well for social entrepreneurs. You can think of it as like a detective story. And so I would say that the main barrier for most people is ultimately telling stories that draw people in through curiosity, learning how to do that.
Such a great question. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
And David, yeah, great insights. I think it gets at, you know, just a common best practice in pitching is why this story and why now. And you might have to wait for the right moment in terms of the why now to pitch a journalist with your story. And the why now is because that curiosity David mentioned, to figure out what's going to happen next. So I thought that was really well put. I know we had a question from Karen. She had messaged me that she wanted to speak up. Karen, do you want to jump in? And if others haven't had the chance to contribute and would like to say something, feel free to just raise your hand on the chat or message me.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I can't open my camera, but I'm Karen, working with Ashoka. And thank you so much. You already gave so much valuable tips, I would say. But I'm currently working with a collective of social entrepreneurs. And then you can imagine we have now 16 and still coming more on board. So how do you pitch a story from a collective, because they all have something to say, and it's just it will become too much, right? I think something that people will recognize in this group is that you want to explain everything about your solution and how good it is and how good it works, etc. And now specifically with a collective, would you have any tips on how to approach to pitch a story for a joint group of people addressing one single problem?
Yeah. I would say that, you know, if you try to pitch the collective, it kind of becomes like, I don't know if any of you ever do watercolor painting, but like when all the colors mix together, it's just brown and it doesn't look very good. You know,
Yeah.
that's kind of what happens if you just merge everything here. You get something that's just confusing. But what's really interesting, and when you have 3 or 4 individual stories or more than that, Karen, what's really interesting is like the brain, our brains, the human brain loves looking for patterns. It's like what we do it 95% of the time unconsciously. We are pattern detectors. And it's why, even though our brains work way slower than computers, even, you know, a 5-year-old kid can decode language better than the best computer because of the pattern ability. So once you get 3 or 4 or 5 stories together, especially if these stories are all speaking to solving a similar challenge or the same challenge, you now are encouraging people and inviting people like, what do you think are the patterns that are emerging out of these things? What are the strategic insights? What can we learn that runs through these ideas that actually run through 1,000 other people's work as well? And that is really, I think, the thing that would be most exciting, especially since you're now talking about pitching a story that's really focused on ideas. As Kat said before, the idea is the hero. And so I think the art would be like assembling configurations. So I wouldn't say all 16 of them, but sub-configurations of the 16 into kind of coherent groups of 3 or 4, where you're basically pitching a really interesting insight and a pattern that we're beginning to see that's emerging from these stories. I mean, obviously from Ashoka, you know, this is the mosaic idea that Bill has been talking about, you know, for 40 years or something. The notion of being able to look for these strategic insights that run through things. It's an absolutely brilliant idea. It's perfect. It's as relevant today as it was, you know, many years ago, but it's not done very often. And so, because assembling like 3 good stories is the key, or a few stories that really make sense.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much. That was super insightful, and I'm gonna work on that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We have something in the chat around storytelling and collective. Did you want to speak to that? Is it Chakri? I want to make sure I'm saying your name correctly.
Yes. Sorry. I'm doing this course called Creating Communities of Hope with Eastside Institute in New York City. And the faculty, Melissa Mayer and Carrie Lobman, they worked us through an interesting exercise last week. And it was basically, as a group, we weaved one story. And I think a couple of rounds of that, and the person before me from Ashoka, I think it could help them create a story for themselves. So that's what my 2 cents was. What my basic learning, I think, is everybody wants to tell their stories. That's for sure. But it's also, is my story getting represented enough? So I think it takes a little bit of a group identity, group dynamic there. I think once you get beyond the dichotomy of us versus them or me versus the group type of thing, I think a collective story emerges. My 2 cents. Thank you for pulling me up.
Thank you. Thanks for your comment. And one thing I'd just note in terms of the collective question, and I think it's part of the value of Catalyst 2030, you know, if a range of groups are working to address a particular problem, there is value in coordinating the narrative around that problem-solving approach. So I'll give a quick example, which is cook stoves. So as you know, or as many of you may know, when it comes to tricky problems in global health and international development, cook stoves and clean cooking it's a very challenging space. There are a lot of groups working to address this problem. Many are struggling for a range of reasons. And I have gotten a number of different pitches, often not super coordinated, because these groups aren't always coordinating with one another on, this great intervention in the clean cooking space. And I think there have been more collectives emerging in that clean cooking effort, but take any challenge in global health, international development, or any realm of social change. I think there's value in collective for groups working on a similar problem to not just coordinate their efforts, but figure out what is the narrative around these efforts, and maybe to be a little bit more strategic in how they pitch journalists. And they might see more traction. So I think that's maybe something Catalyst 2030 could help facilitate. I'd be curious to see, if there are working groups among social entrepreneurs working on a similar challenge, what is their strategy in engaging media? And is there any coordination around that? I think that could be a useful effort. Did others have questions? We want to make sure to bring...
do you have your hand up?
Oh, Drew, yeah.
Yeah, I failed in pitching Catalyst 2030 and Catalyzing Change Week, if I hear y'all, because I just pitched the week and these are all the sessions. So I have to learn to do better. So what would be the tips going forward if we have, I think, 30 issue-based groups, 5 launching from this week, also lots of working groups, etc. What would be the way, what should I do better? Because I have definitely failed. So, and I spoke to both of you, I know both of you, and I did a crap job. So I'd like to learn. I'm being honest.
I mean, it's a longer question and we will follow up, but a story is an invitation, like when you pitch a story, you're inviting someone into something. The kind of invitation now is really important for people to know, because everyone is, we all have email overload. Everyone has too much information coming at them all the time. Nobody can follow media, too many news sources, too many feeds, all of that. So this poverty of attention is a real problem. So the invitation needs to be really clear. And people can say yes or no, but they should know what they're saying yes to and no to without having to spend too much time. So for example, just speaking to Kat's point, which she made, in the cook stove example, if the story is about my organization and our cook stove, that's a feature story. That's a one-off story, and the journalist will only do it one. And it's basically an invitation to sort of do some sightseeing into someone's world. That's what the invitation is. You're going to get to know this organization, what they're trying to do, but it's not really a news story because it's a one-off. It's only looking at one glimpse of it, versus we're going to take you on a tour of the 10 models of cook stoves that seem to be changing the way we think about eating around the world or cooking our food around the world in an environmentally and health conscious way. That's an invitation to learn about the evolutionary changes at our time in the world. That is something that I would make more time for than the previous story, if I know that that's the invitation. So I think in terms of Catalyst 2030, helping people understand what is the specific invitation that is being offered to them and why it's worth an hour of their time or why they should participate in all that. And getting that really clear in your head and making it as simple as possible. Like a headline, a paragraph, the subject line of an email. Those are the things that I think are really important now.
Yeah, and I think I'm reflecting on what David mentioned earlier in terms of people follow their curiosity in a story. And I think in terms of, well, Jeru, one thing that's great is we have a relationship, right? The question earlier on how do you build relationships? David and I know you, we know Catalyst 2030. And I think what we'll want to keep in touch about is what are the challenges that Catalyst 2030 is bumping up against, and what's next for you? How are you addressing those problems? I mean, I think funder dynamics, for example, being like a very real challenge that each of your individual members face, that Catalyst 2030 faces. So I think sometimes there's a tension between what an organization wants to pitch, for example, an event, and what a journalist wants to cover. For example, the tensions that come up in trying to do systems change work. And so I think there are many stories to be told about Catalyst 2030. We just have to identify the right opportunity that strikes that curiosity in readers and allows them to follow their curiosity, as David mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And one other thing that can always be harnessed, which is a really big force in the world today, is in the US, it's called FOMO. I don't know if that's a global term, but it basically just means fear of missing out. And, you know, the idea that like stuff is going to be talked about here, and you're going to be like the less interesting person at the next cocktail party you go to because you didn't hear it. You weren't getting these signals that are emerging from people who are at the cutting edge of their fields. So we're pretty cutting edge in journalism, frankly. You know, if you're a journalist and you want to really know, like, what are the new models emerging for publications, for storytelling, for impact, if you're not aware of solutions journalism, you're a less effective journalist. You're a less effective editor. So we really harness that. We make people feel a little bit insecure about, you know, missing out on what we have to say. And there's, you know, it's not as crassly manipulative as I'm saying, but it can be framed that way too. You can help people know, don't miss this, you know?
We have time for just a couple more questions. And I see that some of our participants are already experimenting with the story tracker, which is great. I just posted that resource in the chat. Any other questions in our last few minutes here? One thing I'll quickly note is...
I think Karis, did you put your hand up?
Oh, Karis. Yes,
yeah.
Please go ahead. Thank you. I missed that.
Yeah. So I'm not a social entrepreneur. I have been, you know, I'm grateful. I'm just discovering your organization right now. I would have been procrastinating too much before reading your stories. I am passionate about solution stories. And so I just quit my job and I am going to cover these stories. And my idea was kind of, there are a lot of solutions, but there's not enough information about these solutions. So people are just reinventing the wheel all the time. And so I told myself I have to create the biggest database of solutions and resources that is, you know, where there's everything, because there are a lot of, you know, databases and medias everywhere. So since I've been in this Catalyst 2030, I've seen that there are a lot of databases. Actually, Catalyst has 500 more, I think, social enterprises and funds and all that stuff. So I'm starting to feel kind of useless. Like maybe my age is not so necessary, and maybe, you know, there was already enough information available. And so my question is, what do you see is the, you know, the need? Where do you see these solutions information ecosystem? Where do you see it lacking? And where is there, you know, a need of something better or something different?
Yeah, what a great question. Thank you for asking that. You know, we've had the same experience that you were describing, Karis, with our solution story tracker. We, like, this is this amazing resource. It's got 12,000 stories. It's kind of the X-ray vision into the adaptive intelligence of the world, right? That's the way it seems to us. But it's really hard for people to use because they go to it and they type in, you know, poverty, or they type in some issue, you know, cook stoves, and they get 300 stories that come out, or 100, or even just 50. What do you do with 50 stories? Who has the time to read 50 stories and go through it and draw out the strategic insights and see these are the 3 core lessons that are emerging from this, basically this experiment set is what we're talking about. So adding the layer of intelligence on top of the database itself becomes the most important thing that's missing right now. And it's specific for every field. So within the Catalyst 2030 community, there are sub-communities who all focus on different things. There are people who focus on rights-based issues, people who focus on delivery of services, maybe around energy, maybe around water or agriculture. I mean, you can break it down. Within the space of like, here's this raw database of resources, and here's a community of 20 people who are looking for patterns and looking for ideas, to create the translation between those two things, the intermediary knowledge, sense, it's really sense making is what we're talking about. Making sense of what you're seeing, distilling it into like I've now processed these 30 stories. I've worked with some people who are kind of, we've come together and we see these as the 5 core insights. They're well illustrated by these organizations. So these could be models. That becomes a really valuable piece of information. That doesn't exist very often. The raw data is actually not that hard to aggregate. It just takes a lot of time to pull it together. But the translation of that into true intelligence and true knowledge is something that really takes thought and time and caring and the relationships then to pass it on to the people. So I think that's for us, that's the key missing, last mile kind of thing in terms of our knowledge dissemination work.
And the only thing I'd add is, you mentioned the challenge of all of these existing databases of what's working, and the solution story tracker is one of them. But I think that's the challenge you articulate is part of why it's so critical that the solutions journalism practice spread. We are moving into this systems change approach to our work, as David mentioned. And when it comes to meeting people where they are, that's not necessarily on databases. All of us might check out the solution story tracker, but meeting people where they are is in their local news, on social media. And so I think what I would like to see is just for the solutions journalism practice to become more, we often say it's just good journalism, right? And if more journalists took this approach day in and day out, these stories would be out there. You wouldn't have to go to a database to find them. And increasingly that's the case, but we want to move the needle even further, hence the systems change approach we talked about earlier. So we have just a few minutes left, and I would encourage all of you to check out in the chat the survey. I know that's important for Catalyst 2030 to get feedback. But David, would just love to close with you in terms of an invitation to this group. I know one of the great things about Catalyst 2030 is these sessions are very action-oriented, and rather than just spend an hour together and say, well, that was nice, and go back to our day-to-day work. Hopefully we all do something differently as a result of this session, and would love to hear from David, just an invitation you have to this group, and we'll close from there.
Yeah, so like our offer is, we are building a lot of tools with the solution story tracker, like ways that it can be embedded, or stories can be embedded in your newsletters or things like that. If there are ways, like, we would love to be able to use this tool, and we'd love to know what your offerings are that could be included in our communications efforts. So we could share stories of solutions on a regular basis or draw them into our network that could be useful. We can help co-create this. We have a team of people who are trying to do that more. So that's one invitation, like, this is what we would love, or this is what would be really helpful to us. And you can just send that to us. The other thing is, if you are yourselves in networks of journalists and you're wanting them to get better at telling solution stories, help us connect with them so we can talk about them and invite them to trainings and see if they want to become part of the network and all that. And that could be helpful to you in your work in terms of, so that they have the sort of the mindset shift that we're talking about. And then finally, like in your work, I guess the biggest invitation is really when you're asking, when you're telling or pitching a story, the fundamental thing I think is really asking what's missing from the public's consciousness that is preventing this idea or this problem from being better solved. What's missing? And when you ask that question, if what comes to you is like more outrage, then your story, you'll know what your story is. If your story is, well, actually, people are paralyzed and they don't know what to do about it, which could also be, if the story is people don't know what to do, they need a sense of credible options, they need hope or something like that. So fill in what's missing in your mind first, and that will tell you what is the kind of story that follows from that. What are the kinds of stories we need to do better and telling more of? Some of them may be in a solutions journalism frame, but some of them will be very traditional, like there's just not enough anger, there's not enough outrage, there's not enough urgency. And that's a more traditional, that can be a more traditional story as well.
Thank you, David. Well, we're at time, and I'm just a big believer in the fact that we cannot achieve the SDGs unless we have these stories of progress being shared from place to place, and solutions journalism is an important tool in making that happen. And you all in the work that you are doing are behind those stories. So we hope that you will be in touch with us as you work to tell them. thank you all for your time. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.